All right, I think we'll get started now. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar about simulation as a tool for policy innovation. I'm Anna Kim. I'm a researcher here at NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute, where we do research and education to inform the development and integration of emerging technologies for defense. So a brief intro just of the topic and how we arrived here. Late last year, when everyone was preparing for ITSIC, we were also thinking about modeling and simulation, but we were thinking about actually sanctions regimes, whether we could move from the standard mathematical modeling to employing more computational or predictive modeling that could help inform outcomes through simulation, either before or during design and implementation of sanctions. From there, we started thinking about other areas that this could apply. You know, DoD has these huge M&S capabilities deployed for things like testing of weapons and systems and materials, plus foreign policy and strategic decision-making in the form of wargaming. And we thought, could those be applied to other defense policy areas where they currently aren't? For example, there are decisions or processes put into place in areas like organizational or financial planning policy that have this huge downstream impact, but they're not generally modeled or simulated. For instance, what if we could model NDAAs or FAR provisions? So we thought it would be interesting to bring together both communities of decision makers and modeling and simulation experts to ask questions like, is it possible to deploy advanced M&S capabilities, especially predictive or simulation capabilities, in service of decision makers and policymakers, and in these areas, with the goal that they could make more informed decisions in policy? Where could this have the biggest impact? Where would it potentially not be as useful? And then how do we go about bridging the communities that would work on these initiatives? So there is already some of this kind of policy modeling and simulation work done in coordination with DoD. For example, supply chain and tariff modeling, which we'll hear about today from one of our lightning talk presenters, workforce modeling, which we've seen in the personnel and operations research community, and disaster relief planning, which will also be highlighted by a presentation to follow today. Here on the screen, we have some other areas that we see as potential areas of high impact, and many of these will be talked about today by our panelists and our presenters. Finally, this is our agenda for the day. And what we really want to talk about with this agenda is how the interplay between DoD and the M&S community can be expanded and what benefits might be accrued by doing so. Our goal is really to find the highest priority challenges to address, and then things like what data sets will be needed, where there might be basic science needed, and begin to make those connections between the right communities. With that, I'll turn it over to our MC for the day, who is Mr. Tubby Schwedo, UCF's Associate Vice President for Federal Relations.
Hey, thank you, Anna, and thank you for all your hard work putting this thing together. It's an honor to be here with such a talented group. Now, before we dive into discussion, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to set the stage and share a little background about the modeling simulation ecosystem we have here in Orlando. I'll promise I'll keep it short, but some of y'all may already be familiar, but for those that aren't, I believe it's relevant. The foundation of Orlando's modeling simulation community dates back to the 70s, where UCF and the Navy had signed an agreement to collaborate on technology. That partnership planted the seed for what has become the nation's epicenter for modeling simulation. Since then, the Navy has expanded its presence here. In fact, they established a base right here in UCF's Research Park, but didn't stop with the Navy. All the other services have actually joined in our Research Park, most recently the Space Force. Today, we're proud to host 6 DoD headquarters in our Research Park, generally 06 level, captain, colonel level headquarters, but PEO Stry is a general officer currently. Now, what makes this all effective is the connective tissue called Team Orlando. Team Orlando brings together the DoD headquarters, National Center for Simulation, the Orlando Economic Partnership, Department of Homeland Security, NTSA, and UCF with its 19 distinct labs and its Modeling and Sim Institute. There's also a range of other partners. With that, it's not just academia and DoD. There's over 100 businesses that are within the Research Park that makes up a modeling sim community of about $8 billion. That includes all the primes, Lockheed, Northrop, Leidos, and a number of mid and small size firms. And having all those players in such a close proximity creates a synergy that drives growth, innovation, opportunity here. And so with that quick overview, I hope you get a sense of what's happening here in Orlando. It's an exciting time to be involved in this community, and this panel is a great opportunity to keep this conversation going. I'd first like to introduce our first lightning panel, and it's going to be led by our very own Dr. David Metcalf, who's the director of our Mixed Emerging Technology Integration Lab at UCF, and Michael Eakins, research associate and creative lead for the UCF Metal Lab. So over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Tubby. It's great to be here with you today and to get to think about and show some of the places where the rubber meets the road with simulation and policy, and some of the new tools we'll be discussing in the Q&A session and the panel that we'd like to share. I do want to kind of give you a little speed tour, though, of some of what that looks like from our standpoint. And the context is important, too, as Tubby mentioned, too, with UCF. I'm not going to read this slide to you, but just the Institute for Simulation and Training sits at a special place with a very large university, very military-friendly university, #1 in a lot of things like game design and cyber defense that we get to lean on as we look at how we can bring some of the best simulation out to the community. And that community is something that that Tubby mentioned too. There's the visuals on it too. A little quarter-mile research park, and then the extended area of our campus, and then extended out to a little bit further with all of those companies, really does set an ecosystem that we get to lean in to help with both advanced simulations for training, but also simulations for decision making that often leads to policies that influence things in a number of different areas. If you think about simulation, it is something that spans across every single vertical industry. So those are the types of things that continue to give us opportunities to kind of drive that a little further and a little bit more intimately within this community. I wanted to give you some kind of rubber meets the road examples of where we've seen this and share some of those different examples with you too. So the first one that we have is when we started to look at how this community was going to be built out, there was policy, of course, as to where the VA was going to put their next center for their next hospital, and also their simulation center. Blue ribbon panel, and looking at some of the areas where simulation can make a difference in that decision making, and then also where that policy and that decision making happened to produce the next generation of simulation center for the VA. So you start to see how these are cyclical and go hand in hand. The example that you see on the right is an example of a hospital scene in mixed reality that shows some of the ways that this simulation is used, and the ability to go and make policy for cyber and physical systems, some of the things that are going to be important to handling, in this case, radiological materials, and what that might look like when you're able to visualize this in a mixed reality environment with a digital wall, a actual set piece of a blood irradiator, a real person dressed in scrubs as a nurse with a headset on that shows a hologram of a security guard, and of course those lines in there too. You're able to start to make some better decisions on this. Go next one. Some of the other tools that we have in here are things like a blockchain and quantum defense simulator. Some of the decisions that are being made about how safe our cyber systems are and how they might be able to be trusted by using protocols like we use for anything from cryptocurrency, but for national secrets, for using blockchain to have an auditable trail and verification of important information, and then tying that in with how we can leverage and use this for some of the post-quantum security that we need, again, to keep those secrets safe and to understand what policies are going to come in place from a cybersecurity standpoint. Some of the ways that we've been able to leverage this is in some of the advanced modeling and some of the tools, review of those tools that are used for decision making across the military. Some of the tools for PMEC, political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure types of decisions, and also DIME, diplomatic, information, military, and economic, are some of the different tools that are used to decide on policy and to look at not only something that's going to be kinetic or that's going to be localized to a region, but could be a whole theater, could be policy that goes beyond doctrine and goes all the way to long-term strategic analysis on these areas. And these are some of the things that we've had the opportunity to not only leverage and look at what those tools that are out there are, but also to put those tools to use and help with that decision making. Closer to home here in Florida, we were able to build something early on about 10 years ago, the first self-driving car simulator in the state of Florida that could switch between some of the areas like a Tesla interface or a GM interface and be able to go and test something out that the state wanted, which was constituent sentiment, to be able to see the technology might be ready or it might not be ready, but are people ready for this? And how is that going to influence policy? This was part of not just a research lab experiment, but something that led to Florida being the second state in the union to allow self-driving cars on our roadways with certain stipulations and, of course, certain policy. That policy was informed by simulation, by that constituent sentiment after having experienced it in a safe environment without putting it on our roadways just yet, and be able to have that. It's a good example of that interplay. And then once the policy was implemented, we were able to build advanced simulations that do everything from testing road signs to testing out some of the user interfaces and the connected vehicle interfaces back and forth between these, with both the simulator like you're seeing, but also with a handful of very generous people who let us use their Teslas and the vehicle connections, the data connections between them, to be able to do advanced simulations, model out certain things at even a fleet level. If you think about it from another perspective, those that are military, we were able to do fleet level testing with some of the most robust and advanced technologies that were still unclassified and still in a consumer setting, but that informed or could inform what you might need to know about a fleet. We've got some new tools. Some of those new tools are allowing us to take what you've had as traditional sand tables or tabletops and bring them sort of to the Star Wars chessboard or beyond, where you have a true hologram that you're able to see something like, in this case, a lunar exercise. This was an exercise that was conducted at Space Power with people from policy, people from think tanks, people from government, people from academia and industry, all coming together to play certain roles on a live tabletop with people negotiating diplomatically, finding out what happened to one of the downed miners in on the moon. It's called Lunar War 2045. And then to be able to inform that. We watched it with a careful eye, not only because it was an important scenario that was built for future policy making, and to really put that to an exercise, but also to see if we might be able to replicate that, speed up certain things using this, in essence, digital sand table, a true holographic table that allows you to even just say what you want. I need a lunar miner, and the AI will automatically generate the 3D of that too, speeding up your white cell activities, which is some of the back-end processing that people have traditionally used to build the assets that are in a scene or that set something up, down to just, in that case, seconds, 22 seconds to go and build one of those 3D models from scratch, something that didn't exist, versus just even pulling it out of a library. These are things that are speeding up and changing the dynamics of how we can actually do this and leverage it. So and then we'll go to the next one here too, another example using the same technology. Today, we're actually conducting for Federal Wildlife Management, CERTIP, and a few others, some wildfire response, both training and showcasing of some of the technologies that are available. This is an example of some next generation technology, again, to be able to, within a couple of minutes, use Stable Diffusion to build a video, this is a video only, of that 3D scene on a table of wildfires, and be able to show the physics of how that wildfire spreads. There are many policies around this too. When should you do a controlled burn? Should you? What are the environmental impacts? What are the impacts of effect on a particular operation or mission? And how do we protect the 43 million acres of federal wildlife and land? Those are some of the different things that we have that showcase some of this. Next thing is to look at this in the context of cyber and how policy is defined for cyber too. Those are some of the different areas that we've looked at with both NSA and DISA to come up with the STIGs that are so important to how we use anything from a thumb drive to the policies on how networks can be accessed and the security and privacy of those too. Remember? And having a whole simulated environment, a virtual world, and a digital twin as test ranges for Internet of Things, for some of these advanced technologies, and the policies themselves has been helpful to a number of different agencies and branches. And we continue to do that even in the age of AI, where we have to think about how humans and how we'll rely on trusted AI that's meets some of the AI assurance models, policy that's been put in place for how we can use this, almost like a driver's license to use AI within the government from the CDAO and their programs that they have for AI assurance, to be able to put these best practices super teams together, is what some of the DOT and E teams are calling it, to look at that enterprise class of the best AI meets the best subject matter experts and the best knowledge bases to produce those effects. And finally, we come to the idea of how we get to test these different things within other branches and other departments and have that informed decisions about the responsible use of AI, to the responsible use of this for training within new policies and new laws that came out, like this new Quantum Computing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act, and how we're going to build off of that. This new HR 7535 shows examples of how simulation training, working in tandem with some of the work that we have there too, gives us an opportunity to flex on things like the living lab that we have in our medical city in Lake Nona, just south of the airport here in Orlando, and companies like Verizon leaning into this and many others too, to be able to effectively tie together some of these advanced decisions and decision making. So as you see here, we have a typical type of operation, and then being able to virtualize that operation for something like disaster management recovery, like we saw with the wildfires, in this case for hurricane, and then to be able to visualize that as if you had set up a 6-screen COP and be able to have that inform some of those advanced decisions. There's a lot of other ones to go through. As I said at the beginning, there's going to be a speed tour, but we are even using this for policy and legislation here in the state of Florida around things like social good of anti-human trafficking and having AI hunter bots that use some of the best of military science and tools like counter-threat financing to go and put simulations in place that can inform policy and have better law enforcement as well. Those are the types of things that we're leaning into as we look at the ways that we partner at UCF and think about these bigger social problems, these bigger enterprise scale problems, and how we're going to affect those and attack those. Over to you.
Hey, thank you, David. That was fantastic. I've sat through that a couple of times and enjoy every time I see it. Next, we're gonna go ahead and move over to Mr. Brad Sagesser. He is the Senior Solution Specialist at Rapid Ratings. Brad, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Just give me a quick, can everybody see my screen out there? Tubby, say yes?
Yep, we do.
Okay, all right. So we're going to be talking about financial modeling here. And Rapid Ratings, we work with a lot of supply chain professionals. And we'll be talking about some of the simulations or stress testing that we've been doing around the impacts of tariffs on the financial health of supply chains. And at Rapid Ratings, we partner with supply chain professionals across the world. And we're really focused on a concept we call financial health. While there are many risks that supply chain risk managers need to manage and measure, financial health is one of those foundational ones. Our research has shown that when companies have weak financial health, they're 2 times more likely to start having issues with delivery and 2.6 times more likely to start having issues with quality. Problems that lead to disruptions to their customers' supply chains. Weak financial health also puts a company at a higher likelihood of defaulting on their debt, which can certainly lead to disruptions to operations. So without going into a lot of detail, we do our modeling through something we call the financial health rating, or FHR. It's a purely quantitative assessment of a company's financial health. It's based on their balance sheet, income statement, cash flow, their fundamental financial statements, as well as the industry sector in which the company operates. We run those financials through our financial health rating model to come up with the FHR, which is an assessment of a company's financial health, delivered on a 0 to 100 scale, with 0 being the worst, 100 being the best, 5 color-coded risk categories. And these risk categories are going to be very important to interpreting the tariff stress testing results I'm about to show you. So down here at the bottom, we have our orange and red zones. Those are our high, very high risk, where the likelihood of a company defaulting on their debt is extremely high. Also, this is where we start to see those performance issues pop up in supply chains. So from a modeling perspective, we do all kinds of stress testing with our clients to model different scenarios and how they might impact their clients' supply chains. We've been doing a lot recently with the impact of tariffs on supply chains. Obviously, tariffs are a tax on the companies, so it's an increased cost to their operations. So we've been assessing, well, how could that increased cost impact the financial health of these companies? So what I'm looking at here is this is a distribution of financial health on 1,146 US-based suppliers to the Department of Defense. We've been doing a lot of analysis on Department of Defense suppliers. This is showing their risk distribution based on their latest year-end financials in 24 or 25. We can see that 17% of the companies are sitting in high or very high risk. When we apply our first tariff scenario, which is we're going to add the increased cost of tariffs to their financials. But in this scenario, we're assuming the company is going to raise prices to cover 50% of the cost of the tariff. And we can see how the risk profile changes when we apply that scenario. We go from 17% of companies in high and very high risk up to 28%, 65% increase in the number of companies in high and very high risk. And the next scenario is they have to absorb the entire cost of the tariff. They're not able to pass through any of that cost to their customers. We see that adds another 36% of companies into high and very high risk in our absorb all scenario. Now, what our clients will do with this information is obviously drill down into the details behind these high-level results to find the suppliers that are being most negatively impacted by the tariffs. Also looking at those suppliers that are stronger ones that are able to handle that increased cost of the tariff better. For a little bit of a benchmarking perspective, this is looking at the same sort of distribution on companies that are in the supply chains of Rapid Ratings, aerospace, and defense supply chains. Same view, looking at what their financial health distribution was based on their latest year-end financials, and the 2 scenarios of raise prices, absorb all. What's kind of interesting on this chart is we can see that these supply chains are a little bit riskier to start, 23% of them sitting in high and very high risk to begin with, versus only 17% for the Department of Defense suppliers. Now, another thing our clients will very much focus on are the differences between public and private companies. We find that 60 to 80% of our clients' supply chains are private companies. So we wanted to look at and model how are public versus private companies being impacted by the tariffs. So on the left, we're looking at the same scenario, increasing costs for the tariffs, raise prices, absorb all. But now I'm looking at a distribution of the Department of Defense suppliers based on what the DoD is spending with these public companies. So now the distribution is not by count of companies, but by spend. We can see based on the latest year-end financials, 27% were sitting in high risk, increases to 35% of the award dollars under raised prices, over 50% when they have to absorb it all, showing us that the DoD has some more significant spends with companies that are already financially weak and will become financially weaker with these tariffs. From the private company side, the picture becomes even more dramatic. What's interesting here is the DoD is working with a number of very financially strong suppliers right now, only 14% down in high and very high risk. But when we give them the ability to increase prices to cover half of the cost of the tariff, we see 121% of companies into high and very high risk. And if they have to absorb the entire cost of the tariff, we're over 75% of those private companies, or 75% of the DoD's spend with high and very high risk companies. And this major difference here between public and private companies is primarily because those private companies are often smaller, working with smaller, often weaker margins. They don't have as much access to capital markets like their public company counterparts do. So this type of modeling simulation that we're doing with our clients on the impacts of the tariffs to their supply chain are really kind of giving us some main talking points or things we're doing with them. We know 2025 is going to be defined by volatility, from rising tariffs, the uncertainty around what those are going to be. Private company financial health is deteriorating faster and increasing risks across global supply chains. But the resilient companies are focusing on transparency and proactive supplier management, often even getting into sub-tier visibility. Who are the suppliers to my suppliers? And now has never been a better time for suppliers and customers to collaborate together to manage and mitigate this risk in these very uncertain times. So with that, Tubby, I'll turn it back over to you.
No, thank you for that. Very interesting, and glad you tied it up in a bow on a positive outlook on how to mitigate some of this. So thank you. So now I'm very excited to introduce Vice Admiral Sean Buck, who will be moderating our expert panel today. Vice Admiral Buck is the president of the National Training Simulation Association and the former superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy and commander of U.S. 4th Fleet and Naval Forces Southern Command. Vice Admiral Buck, back to you.
Thank you very much, Tubby, and great thanks to the University of Central Florida for co-hosting this seminar. I'd also like to give a shout out and thanks to my colleagues at NDIA, the Emerging Technologies Institute, led by Dr. Arun Serafin, and this particular idea and webinar that was put together by Anna Kim. Thank you all. I think we're in for a very thought-provoking hour ahead. The intent of the webinar and this panel portion of it is to be a thought-provoking session where we're going to explore how the development of advanced policy simulation capabilities can provide a more informed foundation for defense policy decision-making, and how DoD and the modeling and simulation community can better connect to expand application of these capabilities as they develop, and some that we'll hear about today. Our hope is that the ensuing discussion between our panelists and then their answers to some of the questions that are generated by the audience will spotlight some real-world examples of policy modeling successes. They'll highlight high-impact opportunities yet to come, and they'll outline the benefits of expanding modeling and simulation tools into new domains. Maybe defense, but maybe in this discussion we'll hear of other domains where we can apply these tools. Let me go over the rule set for a moment. I'm going to briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. We have 3 of them today. They're each going to take 5 to 7 minutes with some opening remarks, and then we'll move as rapidly as we can to the Q&A session. I have generated some questions on my own with the ETI team to prime the pump, but I encourage all that are dialed in today. We are using the Q&A portion of this technology today on Zoom, and generate your questions, and I'll do my best to track those and field them and put them out to the respective panelists that you would like to hear from. Prior to moving forward, though, Brad, if you're still dialed in, there were a couple of questions that were generated on your talk. if you wouldn't mind looking at that section for the Q&A, and maybe you can provide our registrant some answers to his questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Panelist number one is the Honorable David Norquist. David is currently the president and the CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association, headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. He's had a very distinguished career that give him the bona fides to be a great panelist today with this topic, both in the Department of Defense, on Capitol Hill in Congress, and in private industry. In DoD, he has led at the highest levels of the department. He was the acting Secretary of Defense, he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he served for years as the Undersecretary, the Comptroller, and the Chief Financial Officer for DoD. When he was on Capitol Hill, he was a professional staff member for 6 years on the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, and he was a number of years in the private industry. So he's able to aggregate all of that experience, and I think will give us a very interesting dialogue today. Our second panelist is Mr. Dwayne Blackburn from MITRE Corporation. Mr. Blackburn joined MITRE. Since joining, he's established the Center for Data-Driven Policy. The center leverages data and insights from MITRE's FFRDC, as well as independent projects, to inform policies so that they are evidence-based, actionable, and effective. Prior to joining MITRE, Mr. Blackburn did 8 years across 2 different presidential administrations as an assistant director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. While there, he led the development and implementation of government-wide science and technology strategies on a variety of subjects through the National Science and Technology Council, and supported policy initiatives within the National Security Council, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and the CIO Council. And our third panelist, who you just heard from, but I'll give a little bit more fidelity on his background, Dr. David Metcalf from the University of Central Florida. Dr. Metcalf has over 25 years of experience designing and researching enterprise applications and emerging technologies across military, energy, space, and health. He's currently serving as the director of the Mixed Emerging Technology Integration Lab at UCF in their Institute for Simulation and Training. While there, that team has built enterprise IT systems for Google, for Johnson & Johnson, for the VA, for the Department of Energy, the United States military, his own UCF College of Medicine, and many others. Dr. Metcalf continues to bridge the gap between corporate learning, simulation, nonprofit, and social entrepreneurship. Gentlemen, we thank you ahead of time for taking your valuable time to be panelists. And over to you. We'll start with Mr. Norquist. Sir?
First of all, thank you for the kind introduction. I appreciate everybody joining us and appreciate being part of such an excellent panel. What I want to do is sort of start at a high level, which is in policy discussions, everyone uses a model, whether they're thinking about it that way or not. It just, in their head, they say, if I take action A, then action B is going to happen. And so they use these mental models based on their experience, and those suffer from 2 problems. First, very limited data sets, right? When people are doing this off of their experience, they're going off of impressions. They don't have the data to understand how much of a change in A produces an effect in B. The other part is there are multiple factors that aren't accounted for. So somebody may know that if I do sanctions on a country, it'll have an economic effect, but how much of an effect, and what type of sanctions, and what's the consequence? Or if unaccounted for factors, if I wanted to increase munitions productions, I increase the amount of money, but if I'm doing several munitions that all use solid rocket motors from the same factory, there's other factors that I have to solve, or that additional funding is not going to solve the problem. So that as people walk into this, everyone sort of starts with some theory in their head, but without the advantage of a more sophisticated model, we end up in those dead ends. The other direction that the department sometimes goes into is we built extraordinarily complex models that no one else can understand, and they look like a black box. And I think back to the Cold War, where the Army would load all this data about their forces in Europe and calculate how many miles the Russian army would advance into West Germany before it stopped. And if they'd been able to get the advance to stop 10 miles earlier, then that meant that their new structure of their force design was useful. But that didn't provide the understanding of the mechanics or the why, nor did a user have a great deal of confidence in something that was opaque as a black box. And often those were extraordinarily slow. You could do 1 or 2 a year, which means you couldn't do the variation analysis that modern modeling and simulation permits. And there's a tremendous amount of use in the Department of Defense. We've seen some of those on earlier slides: budgeting, acquisition, force posture, force design, supply chain. But really the thing that has been exciting to see in the last set of years is how technology has made so much more possible. So first of all, you think about sheer volume of data, DoD setting up of Advanta with billions of transactions in it. That allows you to do things, whereas before almost all the data you had fit on a decent sized spreadsheet. There you have much more information, much more interesting analysis that you can do. And the tools for it have gotten vastly more sophisticated for the simulation, but also for the visualization. And I really want to emphasize that when you're doing a policy analysis in front of senior leaders, a machine that goes ka-chunk, ka-chunk and rolls out it is less interesting if you cannot visualize what is happening, why it's happening, and put it in a way that makes it easier for the reader to grasp. So the other thing I would highlight is one of the advantages of simulations in your ability to run them over and over again is you start to discover which factors actually matter. So even if your data is imperfect, you may discover that even if I vary a certain factor, it doesn't change the outcome in a meaningful way, whether even if I double it, it doesn't change it. Whereas other ones, you realize a slight change has a very significant effect on the policy impact. That tells you where it's worth spending your time. Where should I invest my resources into more precise information? Because now I'm looking at a factor that makes a meaningful difference. And I just want to end with one particular vignette from the before technology days of simulations. 1923 war game at the Navy War College. Admiral Buck is probably quite familiar with this one, about carriers. And in the early 20s, the average carrier could only have 12 planes, and they were used for reconnaissance. And the answer was, well, 12 planes don't do very much, and I really just need them to help my battleships find their way. So the Navy War College did a simulation where in their simulation, they had 2 carrier groups fighting each other. Each had more carriers than any country had at the time, and each carried vastly more planes than carriers could carry at that time. And one of the teams, the blue team, put all 200 of their planes in the air at once, sent it in a single strike, damaged all of the other team's carriers, and sank the battleship before they got in range. And so what that allowed them to do was to realize that if the most effective factor was being able to attack in volume, then instead of thinking about storing my planes under the deck because it was safe, they realized what I really needed is folding wings so I could put more planes on the deck, arresting cables and catapults for faster launch and retrieval. So the value of that simulation was you can explore things you don't have and start to discover which technology problems you have to solve with your simulation. And then in real life, in order to be able to field a force that does something completely different. And so simulations have been used in the military, but they're all much more limited than more historical war games. And so modern simulations really gives you a chance to take that in an exciting and different direction. So I'll pause there and turn it over back to you, Admiral Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. Mr. Blackburn, over to you for your opening remarks.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for everyone for joining us, as well as NDA and University of Central Florida for hosting this event. Admiral Buck already provided a good background on myself, but one thing I'm going to add, if it wasn't clear, I'm not a modeler, so I'm a policymaker. So I'm here representing the user voice predominantly, and to be more specific, the interagency policy user or policy voice, because most really high-level policy considerations, they kind of go across multiple departments. So there are some internal department ones as well, but I'm more at that cross interagency aspect. So I'll start with a couple of prior examples of how modeling simulation has really impacted policy. a little bit different than what you've heard so far today. One that's kind of easy in the back of everybody's mind because it's somewhat recent is COVID-19. Lots of modeling went into the policy work there. It helped us to predict the spread, assess some mitigation, and really inform lockdowns and vaccines. And to be honest, there was some good and some bad within that work. The early work on modeling early stage lockdowns and initial vaccine rollouts were quite good. But on the bad side, the states all had different data gathering issues. So there's very huge amounts of inconsistencies, which created bad data and created issues for us in modeling things. And we also missed some things. So for example, the modeling didn't really predict the future waves of variants that were going to occur within the next couple of years. Another couple of examples, a little bit different. So in my days at MITRE, we did some MITRE challenges where we kind of posed some government problems and had private sector develop some new solutions for us. One of the ones that we did was on benefits eligibility. That was really tied into President Trump's president's management agenda in his first administration. So we really had to model how federal eligibility programs and benefit programs work in a generalized way so that the private sector could understand it and apply their problems to it. And another one we did was on countering UASs. So we actually had birds flying around the FBI Academy and people physically taking them down, but we had to have good threat matrices as far as how those work. Both of those really helped, not necessarily directly on the policy activities, but it informed what was possible, what wasn't possible, and that informed policies. So it's not always that modeling straight to policy. Sometimes there's intermediaries as well. So let me put my old White House hat back on and talk a little bit about what we need from modeling and simulation. To put it very succinctly, David just kind of mentioned this as well, is to help us answer the what-if questions during policy development. Sometimes that has to be done urgently, and sometimes it can be done very studiously. And the models have to be able to account for either one of those. In practice, going a little bit more in depth, what do we need for modeling and simulation? A few things are most important. To accurately represent complex interconnected systems. That's critically important. We also need to integrate various data sources and understand how to handle the uncertainties or missing data. We can also enable stress testing of policies under different scenarios, not only to predict outcomes, but to open our eyes to possible trade-offs or interventions that kind of lead to policy decisions. And then a couple that are kind of forgotten. One is as you're developing the model, that's actually kind of important not only for the modeling itself, but it builds communities of interest. So it really supports some participatory processes to get those impacted stakeholders together, understand each other's needs, and kind of go forward. And then most importantly, I can't undersell this enough, explain to us the limitations of your model and the results. What are the gaps within the modeling simulation, and how does that really influence what we're learning about it? Now, to be honest, like David mentioned, modeling simulation capabilities have been around a long time doing these things well, but time and cost to do them have almost always been limiting factors. One thing I'm very happy about and excited about looking forward is going to be artificial intelligence future role in modeling and simulation. It's not only going to help us to improve the setup or the models themselves, but probably more importantly, it's going to enable us to run millions of iterations very rapidly, tweaking the variables on each run. That's something that really hasn't been able to be done in the past. With artificial intelligence, it can be able to be done in a few hours. So that's very great. Really provides us good insight on, like David mentioned, what variables are most important and how do we really leverage those. So as part of opening remarks, they asked me to identify 3 future areas of likely priority for advanced modeling and simulation. And again, this is coming from my big national level perspective as opposed to an individual department agency perspective. First one is very DoD focused, so the geopolitical and integrated defense strategy as we're developing all of those. So there's a lot of threats out there that, like a better term, they're hybrid threats. So you got cyber threats, military threats, and then one that probably hasn't been thought of too much, but okay, how do we model the spread of disinformation and how that impacts policy decisions? Very, very big open areas of consideration. Second area, science and technology policy. We're at a weird time in science and technology. This is my background. So we got a handful of technologies that what we do over the next 3 or 4 years is really going to influence national leadership or international leadership for the next few decades. How can we use modeling and simulation to help the US government and the private sector make proper decisions so that we can maintain US leadership in these technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, quantum, biotechnology? China's doing a lot of this, frankly, better than we are at this point, and we need to kind of catch up on some of that. And the third one, infrastructure resilience. We need to strengthen that critical infrastructure. So think power grids, data centers, transportation networks. Not only because our existing infrastructure is aging and needs to be replaced, but also because we're going to have huge artificial intelligence demands that's going to dwarf what we currently have. So modeling and simulation can really help us simulate the stress points, iterate different scenarios, and figure out where do we need to put new energy production, storage, how do we leverage those on a temporal basis in order to meet the nation's future going forward. Some challenges and user needs. So tied on some of these earlier. I'm going to hit this first one up again. Simple explanations with clear limitation descriptions. High quality data, always critical and a big challenge. Bad data always leads to bad policies. I talked about the benefit, the future coming benefit of artificial intelligence in modeling, but that's also going to create risks and trust issues for us as we go forward. Explainability of artificial intelligence is going to be critical. Another challenge or user need to kind of keep in mind is clarity, not only in understanding all this, but to avoid misinformation, which is unknowingly incorrect info, and malinformation, which is proper facts used out of context. As we do leverage modeling and simulation outputs, keeping those in the back of our minds is going to be especially critical. And then finally, recognizing that human modeling simulation is outstanding, helps us significantly in policies, but it's that human judgment, that experienced judgment, that's going to really remain the key, particularly as you start to fold in ethical and other political factors to make those policy decisions. So in conclusion, modeling and simulation has been around for a long time. It's great, but it's going to grow significantly in its influence and its abilities. And that's going to enable us to make better policy decisions for the benefit of the nation. So thank you again, and I look forward to the conversation.
Mr. Blackburn, thank you for that. I think the audience has quickly seen that between Mr. Norquist so far and yourself as a decision maker, as well as a consumer of the results of some modeling to help decision making, you all have given us some great examples. You kind of tweaked a comment possibly from me. If we have time at the end of our session, I will also add a real world example from COVID-19 on how modeling helped the Department of Defense and specifically the Federal Service Academies on what was the best way to test and to be able to most judiciously use the testing assets that we got so that we could continue to achieve our mission without being disrupted by too great a spread of COVID. But I'll hold that to the end if we have a little space. Thank you again, Mr. Blackburn. With that said, over to Dr. Metcalf for your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you. Well, I had the benefit of giving some of my opening remarks in a visual tour of some of the both capabilities, but also some of the past examples of real-world examples of where we've been able to use simulation and some of the techniques for modeling in those settings that have led to certain policies, decision making. But I loved hearing, this is great for me to get to hear from a customer base that is looking at how policy is made and policymakers themselves, because then we can make sure that we do have the arsenal of tools that are going to take us into the future and that are going to allow us to not only compete, but win in this area. And it is heartening to me to see some of those tools in action and to know that some of them are aligned with geopolitical and integrated defense, with some of the areas that you mentioned about science and technology policy coming up, and infrastructure resilience too. Like I mentioned today, the first part of my day was spent looking at some of those policies for wildfire management, out west, what happened there. In the middle of this whole process, we started to get requests from a number of places. we don't care if you're not finished with the study yet. We've got these wildfires out west. Let's go ahead and start to apply some of this. So we didn't get a chance to wait for the cement to dry. We had to start to look at how this could be implemented fast. And I think that's one of the things that could be helpful too, is to think about how these new tools could be used to make good decisions rapidly, and those good decisions to be memorialized in a repeatable process that is policy. So those are some of the things that we're excited about as we start to hear about user needs and knowing about some of the ways to visualize that in explainable ways, not just explainable from an AI standpoint, but explainable from a standpoint of we're looking at more data than ever. And that has its benefits, but it also can be quite complex. And that complexity can even lead to difficulties in decision making. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to see some things that were some simulation that was leading to policymaking in action. We went to Davos and saw Austria doing a whole country economic model of what it would be like if they implemented CBDC, centralized banking digital currency, and how that would change the environment in one country, a smaller country. But that then informed, like you said, a community of practice that got interested in that. The community of practice was not only nation states, but also was some of the largest banks in the world, and particularly the European banks in this case, and looking at what would be needed to implement this within their banking system, SWIFT. And let's, for sake of argument, call it SWIFT 3.0. How would you have a virtual sandbox to go and test those things out, test out different protocols, test out different blockchain protocols, test out the resilience of that from a cyber standpoint? Could they resist quantum attacks? There were so many layers of things that needed to be done with this. How could you add intelligence to that transaction? There's something called smart contracts for a while, still is inside of blockchain. But if you think about a smart contract, almost like being your escrow agent rolled up into the transaction for buyer and seller and everyone trusting everybody all in one, now add the power of AI. So what have I just described? There's all this stuff I described, but a very wise colonel said to me, you need to simplify all this systems integration stuff and everything down to ABC. AI for the smarts, blockchain for the trust and some of the transparency, and then C for cyber. And I said, I can do that as long as the C is also post-quantum cyber. And sure enough, since that day, probably every one of the projects that we've seen has had some elements of all of those in there, as well as one more important thing that Mr. Norquist said, that we really need to make sure that the visualization of this is good. And looking at that from the standpoint of another modern technique of digital twins, that's something we've been doing in a number of different areas. But in this particular case, you could see how having a digital twin, being able to model that out and visualize it in a way that's explainable, in a way that's understandable, has helped to inform a number of things. And here we are a couple of years later, and we're looking at new laws, new policies, new regulation, of course, too, with SEC, CFTC, for how this might happen in the US and other places. This is some of those fundamental changes that being able to model that out, doing Kubernetes that show a number of possible scenarios with different variables is quite helpful, not just from the financial standpoint, but even like I mentioned with the self-driving cars, pretty progressive at the time we were doing that. And to think about the idea that are the people ready for it? The technology might be ready, but are the people ready for it? Is society ready for it? Is our government ready to monitor that with policy and with enforcement of that policy? So we don't have a toothless tiger on some of these things. All of those things can be modeled and simulated too. Those tabletop exercises like the lunar exercise is an example of where that can be potentially useful. And we're not using all the time new techniques. We're using some proven techniques, some good decision science, things like counter threat financing to track down the bad guys that would operate in a system like this and how you could mitigate for that before the policy is even inked dry, and how you might also use that for better decision making that allows you to kind of attack some of the other things you looked at with good data and how you have that good data for decision making. In some of these scenarios, I keep going back to decision making, because in high consequence areas, we've sometimes seen like a complex weather, having access to these 3D visualizations on the holographic table with no glasses. It's not about the gimmick or the technology itself. It's about the fact that things like complex weather, breast cancer screening, or complex full theater floodplains, or the fires, or things like that, you all of a sudden have a way to see additional data and to visualize it without having to over explain it. And some studies have shown that leads to 20 to 30% better decision making. That's what we care about, not which technology we're using, which flavor of the day AI might be the best to use, but are we getting better outcomes? Just like you kind of alluded to this, garbage in, garbage out. We need to have that good data in there too, and also account for those holes to be able to do that. So that's a little bit of commentary based on the fine introductions that you guys both gave, and the ability to kind of see where we might address some of that with the hopefully modern technologies and the ones that are going to take us into the future. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Metcalf. Very good. And it has already, your particular remarks have already generated a few questions from our audience. I'm going to cut right to those, to one of them, and then I'd like to get back to some generated questions I have that are going to get to allow our panelists to get to the nuts and bolts of how we're going to bring decision makers to those of you in the M&S industry to help solve that. One of our attendees has asked the following question with a little bit of context up front. So this is addressed to Dr. Metcalf. Statistics allows one to compute the size of the sample space to determine the accuracy of a decision. AI decisions can provide the user the probability of the presented decision. To allow a user to work with AI to improve decisions is to provide the user the probability of a set of decisions. His question: is this an area for AI to provide the statistical accuracy of the decision or decisions? And is this a component to present to the AI user?
The short answer is yes, but with guardrails. And one of the things that we've seen is that to be able to do regression tests, to be able to do Kubernetes, to run multiple scenarios, as long as you have a reasonable set of data or fictitious data to run that against, then yes, you can get better decision making because you can take out some of the uncertainty with that too. Now, I say that with guardrails because of two things. One that I want to reiterate that I said earlier too is that there are new emerging standards for how to do this effectively within the government domain, almost like a driver's license for AI to go and use, you name it, Copilot, Grok, OpenAI, ChatGPT, all of those different tools, and to make sure that you're understanding at least where there's opportunities for hallucination, which is where it makes up stuff, and where there's opportunity to make sure that you have explainable AI, as Mr. Blackburn said too. And that explainability and that ability to have realism in your data and only to deal with that data is extremely important if we're going to use this for any type of decision making, as is another guardrail. And that is not just allowing the AI to run amok with whatever prompts you might put in, but to have a quality control layer or two. Sometimes there's another layer of AI that can act as a quality control, almost like as if you had another person who is doing that. And then, of course, your human subject matter experts to make sure that they go in and review this too. Again, that explainability is important so that they can see, almost like in a mathematical proof, show your work. And you can go and see that. And that's very important. The CDAO has come out with an AI assurance certification program with levels that is something that their policy should inform how we use these things. And maybe those are some of the areas that, if you're interested in that you should lean into to make sure that you are conforming to best practice, especially if you're in the military or government. But it's probably a good idea for all of our contractor friends and others in academia to think this way too. It's a great question. I could go on for a long time, but that's the most succinct answer I give. Over.
Thank you very much. This next question is directed toward Mr. Norquist and Mr. Blackburn. Mr. Norquist, if you'll answer first, but we'd also like to hear from Mr. Blackburn. The question is, what is the best way to connect the policy problem owners in DoD with people who can provide modeling and simulation capabilities to help address those problems? How are connections like this usually made? How does DoD usually seek out more unconventional solutions to problems like these?
So I'll start with an example of when DoD started to field Advana. Now, Advana is not as much a modeling and simulation tool as it is a data lake of information upon which people can put both analytic tools, visualization tools, and then use it if they've got the right tools to do predictions. And what we found was that the people who understand the technology and the people who understand the problem they are trying to solve come from very different communities with very different skill sets. And the model we found was most effective is we had a core of people who understood the data analytic tools in Advana, and we would pay for them centrally. And they would go to different communities that were interested in using the data to solve their problems, to do their analysis, and sit down with them and be able to put up on the screen with rapid iterations, here's the things that the tool can do. And so it would show that I can count widgets. And the person would say, I don't actually care about widgets, I care about 155 millimeter artillery rounds. Well, to the data analytics person, those are two different fields, but they're the exact same problem. So they switch widgets out for 155s. But to the policy user, that's gone from irrelevant to relevant. And we talked about COVID. One of the examples we had during COVID was a map of the US where we could track cases in order to alert some of our local commanders as what was happening around them. But it wasn't the count of cases that mattered. What mattered was the change in the count of cases, which told you whether there was an outbreak of growing cases in your area. Well, to the data analytics person, to the modeler, if I have numbers at different points in time, the rate of growth is just a subtraction formula and a division. I can plug it in and that's easy. But the value of that information to the user, who may not be aware of what is possible, is dramatic. And so what we found is it took multiple iterations of somebody who knew the tool. And we kept the same tool people as we moved around, in part because they started to discover the users had somewhat similar types of questions and needs. So they got better at anticipating what the user wanted, but it was really the person who was solving the problem, whose problem they're trying to solve, who understood what data mattered, what trends, what patterns, what predictive factors matters, what things were relevant. And the tools users and developers were the ones who were able to bring it to life. And so in the Pentagon, we had the comptroller's office who owned the Advana tool. They had the core team. They would send it around to visit different offices on those who were interested. And when I moved to deputy, we'd sometimes bring him into my office. But it was that back and forth between them with regular iterations that then allowed you to start to see the quality of the answer improve and the relevance improve to the user. And the user benefited from seeing how it was developed. So they could just start to see, they just had trouble seeing what was possible unless somebody showed them different flavors of ice cream. They, oh, well, that actually matters to me. So let me pause there. But our view is a core team that understood the tool, working with different users and helping them envision what's possible.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Blackburn?
Sure. Connecting policymakers with potential users or modelers is critically important. And frankly, it's underdone, to be honest. The easiest, simplest idea is just hold a workshop. It's perfectly within legal bounds in most federal agencies for them to get outside the federal government walls and have conversations with the private sector entities and experts doing things. Lawyers tend to get in the way a lot, particularly if there's acquisition processes up there, but that's critically important to sit down, get the groups together and have conversations. A couple of tangents on that, tangents isn't the best word, but similar issues. If you're really having trouble as a federal agency enabling you to do that, you can leverage your FFRDC, your Federally Funded Research and Development Center. They are statutorily developed entities owned by the federal government pretty much for that purpose, to have one foot in the federal government side and one foot on the outside, and have serve as that bridge. So they can easily do that within legal bounds, not much issue. And then the last thing I'll bring up, I raised this in opening remarks, but challenges. We've integrated that into the acquisition process inside DoD and other federal agencies. You can do challenge-based acquisition. You can just do price challenges, but that's an outstanding, easy way to get your needs, your concerns, your issues out there to a whole host of entities at no charge to them to play around with your data, your problems, and to provide example solutions for you. Sometimes you get solutions. Sometimes the challenges will help you understand where you don't necessarily have the correct insights, but it's going to be beneficial for solving the problems, solving the policies, and having those interactions between the people that own the problem and the people that own the solutions.
Thank you. Appreciate that specificity. Those two combined answers, very, very helpful. Dr. Metcalf, over to you. This is a technical question that you may have witnessed at UCF and or other areas in academia. The question is, are there ongoing studies addressing the risks of confabulation, hallucinating, and or jailbreaks and prompt injection attacks?
There are. Yeah, the CDAO is doing some of that work with Dagger and Shield, DAGR and Shield. And at the I'm talking to policymakers a lot of times, so I'm talking about things that are policy oriented too, and where that lives within the military and federal government. But also these companies are also doing this on an ongoing basis. They want to have the least amount of hallucination possible, unless you put that AI into a quote unquote creative mode. And they are trying to make sure that they have the most accurate tool possible with the largest data sets and the best weightings and training. So there's ongoing vigilance. There's also sets of standards emerging to see how closely these things map to human intelligence, if you want to put that in quotes for a minute, and think about the ways that you can do that. There's human code and other things that show the accuracy, especially in things that require high accuracy, like language, like programming languages, and of course, high-level, high-consequence decision-making. So those are the areas that this research is being done and ongoing. To mitigate this while we still live in this between state, I've seen some really interesting models, HATS and AI super teams from DoD. Tetra in particular has been doing some great work. We just had a summit here recently that got to hear from some incredible minds from across a number of different laboratories, a number of different organizations. I mean, MITRE was there, a number of different academic institutions and research institutions, SWRI, GTRI, and getting to hear about these models that take the best of human intelligence, the best of artificial intelligence. You saw me flash up on the screen for just a moment in our speed tour, we're the UCF Knights of the Round Tables, a play on the word of data tables, but then also thinking about, knights. Who are the knights? They're wise people that come around a table to make collaborative decisions. And like you said in one of your other questions there too, that collaborative decision-making process are multiple AIs coming together along with multiple knowledge bases, so you have the best data possible. And then, of course, the human subject matter experts coming together, going to produce a better result in decision-making than any one of those by themselves. The early answer looks to be yes. As a researcher, I don't want to say yes. I just want to say there's good hypothesis and positive indications in the early study of this area, and it's a great area for ongoing study. We hope to continue to be part of that. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Back over to Mr. Norquist and Mr. Blackburn. This applies to you all while you were serving in government and or serving supporting government. The question is, what, if any, policy simulation or advanced modeling capabilities did you encounter or use, and were they useful if you did use them? Second part of this question, are there any policy issues that you worked on where you think it would have been particularly useful to have modeling and simulation capabilities accessible to simulate outcomes of your problem set? Mr. Norquist?
So there's a couple of them that I use, and I suspect there were more that were going on behind the scenes before I got the briefing or the presentation, where somebody may have showed me the outcome without always showing me the model they used behind it. One of them was when I was at Homeland Security. Homeland Security during the Bush administration was dealing with the immigration issue. When you detain an immigrant, you have to put them in a detention facility with beds, and you had to model the process of how many beds do you need, how many else do you think, all the way through their adjudication and their return to the country or their admission into the United States. By building a model and running it, what they discovered was that although the primary cost of driving this was beds, that wasn't the limiting factor. The limiting factor was the number of judges to hear the cases. And that rather than spending a lot of money on building more beds, if you expanded the number of judges hearing the cases, you open the spigot and drain the tank. You move things through much faster. And so it was very fascinating for our secretary, because the judges weren't actually part of his budget, that his recommendation to the White House was, don't give me more money, give the judges more money, hire more judges to do this, and then I can function and manage the volume of cases within the existing facilities that I have, as long as there's a matching number of judges. So that was a model that saved the taxpayers a lot of money, but also really helped emphasize to the organization where the choke points were in the system. I've also seen similar things done with munitions. This gets more complicated. They have different ranges, different capabilities, but when you match them up against target sets and you ask yourself, which are the best munitions against which target sets? Where am I short? What is the volume I need? What's the relative cost of each? It became very helpful to understand where you actually needed something that was very sophisticated and extraordinarily fast, and where that was a lot of money that didn't give you much meaningful benefit over existing less expensive solutions. So those are places that were very useful. In each case, not the great visualization that you've been seeing with the presentations today. Good analysis, but the visualizations improved. If you asked me when I was in the department or today, what I would find the most useful, it would really be a model that allowed you to insert certain assumptions about a high-end conflict like we've seen in Ukraine, and then raise the question, what runs out first? Do I run out of 155 millimeter artillery rounds or surface to ship missiles? Do I run out of the munitions or the planes first? Do I run out of brigade combat teams to move or the ships that are supposed to lift them? Because in each case, we've built the quantity to be able to manage, but if you run the model enough times, you may realize that you have more capacity in one place than you can actually get to the fight, and you will run out of something else vastly sooner. That type of a model where you'd run it with certain assumptions to get a band of outcomes would be tremendously valuable. Probably another one would be modeling standing up a production facility. There's this theory that people have that in World War II, the war started and miraculously the Defense Industrial Base started producing airplanes and ships in an extraordinarily volumes. They tend to forget that Europe went to war several years before we did. So we had already started ramping up, and most of the cool movie shots are from 1944, not 1941. And so in a modern war, how long is reasonable to be able to bring online another munitions factory, another missile factory, another shipyard? Those types of things would be helpful to understand, particularly to know the limiting factors that can potentially be addressed in advance. So I'll pause with those, but those are the examples that I came across.
Yeah, great specificity. Thank you, sir. Mr. Blackburn?
Yeah, that's good. I'd forgotten about your DHS judge example. I was around for that one. That was a good example. Examples of some that I was around, I'm going to go off on a little bit different tangent just because it's important for this community to recognize that it's an opportunity. Economic impacts of proposed policies. There are legal and OMB requirements for most policies and regulatory considerations that the White House has to deal with from an interagency basis. And so I constantly was reviewing these economic impact models and assessments of various policies. I'm not an economist. I didn't understand it while they're getting briefed. I'm kind of giving the side eye to the folks on the Domestic Policy Council, make sure they're agreeing with it. But once it was done, that played a large role in a lot of really non-economic decision making. Remember, I was there after 9/11, so much everything was really driven by abilities of science and technology and other matters to fight the global war on terror and protect the nation after 9/11. But that economic stuff played a huge role in all those decisions, and that's often not forgotten about. Similarly, CFIUS cases, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, when a foreign entity is purchasing a U.S. company, the U.S. government can review it. If there are national security ramifications, we can block or modify that transaction. Lots of modeling went into there. Obviously, there's economic aspects of it, but all tons of manufacturing, sales, national security ramifications from those various sales. So those were both of those cases were something I encountered multiple times a week for the 8 years that I was in the White House. Now, thinking back, you asked, so where would some modeling have been better used? Yeah, that's always the fun question. Where did y'all not get it right? So the one that kind of popped in my mind because it's in the news again, Real ID, so consistent requirements for driver's licenses. That was something that was called for in statute, and the requirements were issued for over 20 years ago. But it's just now, this year, really being implemented. And some states and individuals still weren't prepared for it. We kind of missed some of that. So we did use modeling simulation to really simulate some compliance costs and economic impacts, of course. But frankly, we could have done a little bit better job using it to maybe assess some of the security trade-offs, tweaking some of the things in hindsight. But really, more importantly, to predict, just like what David gave the example with the judges, what are some of the process and funding bottlenecks at the individual states? Because that was really what was ended up being the limiting factor for implementing that law.
Yeah, gentlemen, those are great specific examples from your respective experiences. Thanks. And what that also showed was how wide open all of this decision making is across many domains to modeling and simulation to help out as opposed to hinder, to make pure decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 3 minutes to go in this panel session, and I'm going to let Dr. Metcalf have the final 3 minutes, sir, if you can stick to it, because I'm going to ask you a very broad question that you could go on with for hours. But the question is, what emerging technologies or processes are shaping innovation at the intersection of policy making and modeling simulation? Maybe you can come up with a few. What are the best emerging technologies that you can tell the audience about?
Well, I'm going to go with my old reliable based on some of our recent research of ABC and then add D, AI, blockchain, and cybersecurity, post-quantum cybersecurity, and then the D for digital twins, kind of that advanced visualization that maybe puts this into a context for that particular end user of the information, decision maker, policymaker, and tries to hide some of the complexity, but also expose some of the transparency of how you have AI that's smarter, have blockchain that's more transparent, more trusted, and then, of course, your safety and security within cyber and post-quantum cyber. Those are some of the building blocks that we see for the back ends of the enterprise systems that are going to drive next generation decision-making and perhaps policy-making too, not forgetting all of the great science from psychologists, from ethicists, from some of the political science realm, social sciences too, which are every bit as important as any new technology, and we stand on the shoulders of those giants. Over.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you each for giving us your valuable time and even more so your valuable experience and ideas of how industry and those out there in the audience can look to continue to contribute to solve problems for DoD, for national security, as well as industry. With that said, I also see on my list of questions from the audience, there were a few that we did not get time to answer. The Emerging Technologies Institute team will take those questions, and after the fact, we'll field them to our panelists for their consideration. and do our best to get you answers. So you weren't ignored. We just ran out of time so that we can press on to our last lightning round. Tubby, back over to you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, gentlemen. Fantastic panel. Gave us a lot to chew on. For our last presentation, I'll turn it over to Dinesh Verma. He's the Executive Director for the Systems Engineering Research Center. Dinesh, over to you.
Thank you, Tubby. Can you hear me, Tubby?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I appreciate that. As Tubby said, I'm engaged with the UARC, the Systems Engineering Research Center, and the Acquisition Innovation Research Center. The panel and the discussion that resulted from it gives us a really good context for two of my colleagues to give you demos and a sense for where we are headed within Eric with regard to applying some of the methods and ideas that have been discussed in this panel. I'm going to begin with something that Mr. Norquist said in his opening remarks, that all of us come into any decision with mental models. And so the idea that models are used is rather has a lot of legacy. Today, what we're dealing with is having to make those decisions, albeit with our mental models, in a context of extreme complexity. And often, our mental models may not always take into account certain unintended consequences. Now, the panel also discussed that we have a ton more modeling capability available now. AI was mentioned. There's other modeling paradigms that we can leverage that weren't available to us perhaps 2, 3, 4 decades ago. But one of the things that we found as a common theme is the centrality of data. When we are creating a policy simulation, our ability to have access to data, our ability to have access to those that will use the models, the model users who come in with a tremendous amount of expertise honed over long years. And then, of course, our ability to engage with them as we go through agile development loops as we create these models. And certainly visualization is key. With that context, what I'd like to do is introduce you to two of my colleagues. Alex Shee, who's a doctoral student at Purdue University, working closely with Dr. Dan De Laurentiis. We were asked by the DoD to create a simulation that might help us better understand the K through 12 education system in the US and what interventions might make sense to get more of our kids to perhaps make decisions towards pursuing STEM careers. Think of the presentation and demo that Alex is going to take us through as just an exemplar of the kind of thinking that we might have as we try to think about addressing other policy questions. And then Dr. Doug Baitner is going to follow Alex with some thoughts and ideas that we have, where some of the faculty members within ERIC are proceeding already with creating a policy test, acquisition policy test laboratory as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alex. And after Alex is done, Doug is going to follow, and hopefully we stay within our time allocation. Over to you, Alex.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Verma. So today I'm going to give a quick demo of how we use system dynamics models to support decision-making in STEM education policy. So I'll start with a little bit of context. We know that the STEM pipeline supports many capabilities that are critical to national priorities, including in defense. But the data shows that only half of those enrolling in a STEM degree eventually graduate with one. And of those, only 60% then move on into STEM-related jobs. Now, there are interventions to curb this attrition, but they're hard to calibrate as the outcomes can take years to show. So what we're asking is, how can we better test and calibrate these policy interventions under different scenarios before we implement them? So we can use system dynamics to model the policy impact on the STEM pipeline. And system dynamics simulates how complex systems evolve over time using stocks and flows. And in our ecosystem, the stocks will include the students and the graduates flowing through the pipeline, and the flows will measure the movements into and out of these stocks. There are also driving factors that shape these stocks and flows, including variables like the financial status, as well as academic capability. We can design policy interventions to target these factors and influence the overall system output. And with empirical data that quantify these driving factors, we can then simulate and test policy scenarios. So for our model, we are focusing on the college segment that is marked out by the black box here. And we use causal diagrams to model how policies act on the STEM pipeline. So these seek to capture the key dynamics and dependencies that relate the policy to the driving factors of the system. So for example, scholarship programs can boost the student's sense of achievement and also help to alleviate some of the financial burden, thereby increasing overall STEM persistence. And I will show some simulations using this policy example shortly. And the model that we've built can be used in several ways for policy design analysis as well as calibration. So for example, we can run Monte Carlo simulations on variables that have uncertainties and track the confidence intervals of some of the system outputs that we're interested in. We can also use it to conduct policy impact analysis, cost and benefit analysis, and sensitivity analysis. So I will now show some examples of these in the simulation demos. So let me now move over to the model view. So this is the model interface that the users will see when they first access it. And it's designed to guide policymakers through a series of steps if they're setting up the model from scratch with new data. And for today's demo, we'll go straight into a policy simulation that's focused on scholarships. So in this scenario, we're considering a policy intervention here that offers a STEM scholarship to freshmen with the goal of improving the retention between year 1 and year 2 of the college. So this policy is set to begin at around time step 47, 48, as indicated by the blue line here. And I'll start the simulation in a moment. Let me move the bar. Okay, I'll start the simulation here and show how some of these variables will change. So now it start at time step equals to 20. So this corresponds to that change here. So one of the things that we might be interested in is how the policy affects things like the throughput from year 1 to year 2, and subsequently the overall throughput to year 4 graduation. So these are the red and black lines that you see here. And on this interface, we have several sliders, and we can use that to change decision variables within the policy. So if I increase the number of scholars in year 1, for instance, and also increase the scholarship amount, we can see that there are corresponding changes in the red and black lines accordingly. And changing the start year simply shifts when this intervention and the effects will occur. And we might also be interested in something like the broad system level view by looking at the inputs and outputs of the system. So the input for the overall system is the number of incoming college students, and output is the number of graduates we have after year 4 in this pink line. And there's a bar here that allows us to change the input variable, so we can move it up and down. And this adjustment setting allows us to calibrate the overall model to specific test contexts, whether it is at the level of a single institution, a state system, or at a national context. The next thing we can look at is in terms of cost tracking. So looking at the graph at the bottom here, the blue line here shows the cost of the year 1 scholarships, and this is calculated by multiplying the number of scholars by the scholarship amount. So that will respond to changes in both of the variables, including number of scholars as well as the scholarship amount. And this is useful in helping us understand what is the cost implication of our policy choices. And in some cases, institutions and policymakers may need to find ways to raise revenue in order to cover some of these costs. For schools, one potential revenue source is tuition. So in this model, we can simulate a feedback loop where some portion of the scholarship cost is passed on through tuition increases. So we have a slider here that represents how that adjusts the cost burden that is carried by tuition. So at a value of 0, it means that none of the scholarship cost is carried by tuition. And at a value of 1, it means that all of it is passed on through tuition increases. So as I move this slider, the brown line in the bottom graph marks the tuition cost increase per student, and it increases as we shift more of that cost to tuition. So why does this matter? Because we know that as tuition increase, that can be second order effects. So fewer students, for example, may be able to afford college. We can now go back to the input graph here that we saw earlier and look at this brown line in terms of the number of incoming college students. So now we see that at the point where the policy is implemented, there is a slight dip, and that is the result of the higher tuition reducing college affordability. Now, if we reduce the portion that is covered by tuition to 0, we see that this line goes back to the baseline numbers. And this is one way of how we can use the model to explore and visualize policy trade-offs, as well as perform some cost and benefit analysis. So I'll stop this particular simulation and go to a different view of the model. So this is the overview of the stock and flow model that we're using. It's a more detailed version of the simplified one that is shown in the slide earlier. So let's say we're particularly interested in the number of year 4 STEM graduates as a policy outcome, right? We can select that as our output variable and run a series of sensitivity analysis. So here's how that works. When I run this analysis, the model first runs a baseline simulation, and then it runs multiple simulations where each variable is individually adjusted by plus or minus 10%. We can then plot a series of sensitivity analysis graphs to look at how that output is affected by the different variables. So the blue and red lines show the upper and lower bounds for each variable perturbation. And we can see that for the output that we're looking at, variables like the average STEM retention rate in year 4 or the number of students entering college will affect that by quite a bit, because these are some direct drivers of college throughput. On the other hand, if we scroll down, we can see that this value is less sensitive to variables like the number of students who convert from a STEM major to a non-STEM major in year 4, because those numbers are very small to begin with. And as a result, small variations in that won't have a significant impact. So to just reiterate a point that was made earlier in the panel discussion, this information can be useful on 2 fronts. First, if we're looking to design policy interventions, we might want to focus on the variables with higher sensitivity in order to maximize impact. But at the same time, for the variables with high sensitivity, we also need very reliable data, because small errors in these data can propagate into very large uncertainties in model outcomes. And at the end of the day, this model is only going to be as good as the underlying data that we have. So this concludes my quick demo, and I'm now going to hand time over to Doug to do the second part of this. So Doug, over to you.
Thank you. So let me get a share going here.
Stop.
All right, please confirm when you can see it.
We can see it.
Okay. So really quick, I'm going to keep my camera off, and I apologize for the raspy voice. I'm fighting something right now. The group at ERIC is working collaboratively with the CERC. So we've got a number of different CERC and ERIC individuals working this. You can see on the right-hand side. One of the things that we've been focusing on here on the next one is let's say a fundamental mission statement, to where we are attempting to develop a collaborative environment that's empirically based. I got the data behind it, and the benefits and costs of which we can pull together and test some of these statute regulations and policies. And so with a collaborative environment, as you can imagine, you get a bunch of different stakeholders into a room or into an environment and start talking about the potential effects, cause and effects of some potential policy change that we'd like to make, and then allow both Congress and DoD stakeholders to work together to identify these. So even within our group, we've actually been back and forth quite a bit on what's a good example that we can use where we've got data. And fundamentally, we kind of came back to the Space Development Agency use of middle tier of acquisition as an example. So the MTA has or the SDA, I should say, has an MTA only approach. There's a few other caveats with how they actually do their acquisitions, but fundamentally they try to keep it down to about a 2-year approach, and then an MTA is only good for about 4 to 5 years, I think, 5 years if I remember correctly. So that was fundamentally the identify the policy question, the first aspect of that. And then in so doing, obviously, can we find data? And so one of the things that's really nice is there's lots of data out there, for example, on, I'll call it the MCA approach, how you're going to build a big, large satellite, and how long that takes from soup to nuts, if you will, from when you start a contract to when you actually get it on orbit. The average times have been anywhere from about 7 years to 12 years. And so we can basically set that up as a separate example to compare with the SDA approach. And then once we had those two concepts in mind, Zoe and I from GW basically sat down on a whiteboard. This would have been the collaborative environment, if you will, and kind of mapped out what that would look like from a simple model standpoint. And that's the satellites there on the left-hand side. And so then it literally took me about a day and a half to work with ChatGPT to then come together with a discrete event model to generate the sliders on the right-hand side and then the graphs. And so I can sit there and play with that, and then you can see the effects in terms of the SDA model putting something on orbit versus the big, large satellite development putting something on orbit. And so that's it in a nutshell. And again, we are trying to go to where we can try and automate as much of this as possible and build an ecosystem to where policymakers and stakeholders would have the ability to work collaboratively and to be able to develop these visual outcomes from their policy questions. And that's it. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much to the ERIC team for that really interesting demo. Thank you to all the attendees for logging on today, to all our speakers for your presentations and remarks. I personally noted a lot of interesting points on things like how to source relevant and quality data and tools for sourcing solutions, plus how tech like AI is going to shape these initiatives. As a note to all of you, we see this as hopefully the first step of a broader initiative on this topic of policy modeling and simulation. So if you're interested in being a part of that or sharing your thoughts or knowledge, please do feel free to reach out to us at the emails you see on screen. I have a couple upcoming ETI events to highlight. Next week, we'll have a webinar on the 28th on quantum supply chain vulnerabilities within NATO. And then at the end of August, on the 27th to 29th, we'll be holding the third iteration of our Emerging Technologies Conference and Exhibition. Registration for that will be open in June at ndiatechexpo.org. With that, thank you all again for joining. Thank you, Tubby, for serving as our wonderful MC, and have a great day, everyone.